Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to keep on talking about methodology and undesigned coincidences, hoping to clarify some things relating to that argument form. What I want to talk about today are some broad considerations. What kind of independence are we looking for if a coincidence is to be undesigned? And then what kinds of evidence can lead us rationally to believe that we have that kind of independence? So first of all, what kind of independence are we interested in? Now, I discussed this somewhat back when I did a series on multiple attestation, and I'll see if I can find that, put a couple links in the description for this video. Multiple attestation and undesigned coincidences are very closely linked. In fact, arguably a statement that is multiply attested in the relevant sense really is a type of undesigned coincidence, though only one type. And what I emphasized there was that what we're looking for is that two different statements from witnesses or documents or something like that each have their own causal line going back to the relevant facts of the matter. Or you could have three, you could have more than two. Okay, I'm not trying to limit it to two, but that the causal line should go back to reality. So instead of the causal line going from reality to one of the accounts and from that account to the other account, as you would get if one person is repeating what he learned from another person. Or as you would get if there was the reality went to some common source account, and then these two or three things down here are just grabbing bits from that common source and telling them separately, but they're all getting it from one common source. So if you had, for example, an AP news story that contained a bunch of facts about a recent fire or something, and then you had different news outlets that were just cutting parts from that release, okay, and this one gave one part and this gave another part, but they don't have their own separate causal lines going back to what happened on the night of the fire, then they are not independent in the relevant sense. Okay, so you'll remember if you watched those videos about multiple attestation that I emphasized it's not the relevant kind of independence if it's just independent imagination. So if Luke and Matthew both have access to some kind of oral tradition about Jesus being born of a virgin, and then they just use their imaginations and they make stuff up to kind of add bells and whistles, then they're not independently attesting even what they're getting from that common core source. That common core source then, other than reality, that's just one source. It's not two sources about what happened. So that's what we're looking for. If we have an undesigned coincidence, each person or account is going back to what happened. You know, whether they agree or disagree, okay, they're going back to the relevant facts of the matter and not being based either on one another or on a common source. Interestingly, you can actually have a given person have an undesigned coincidence between two statements that he himself makes. And I know that it's a surprise, but I'll give you an example. Suppose that I tell you about a recent detour in my town, and that when I'm going to a certain store, I have to take that alternate route to get around road work. Okay? And then on another occasion, I tell you about seeing a deer jumping out by the side of the road. I mention that I'm going to that store, and I name the road I was on when I saw the deer. Okay? And it's one of the roads that you would need to take for the detour. Now, how is that an undesigned coincidence with myself? Well, because when I tell you about the deer, I'm not thinking about the detour. I'm not trying to make that story of the deer fit with the fact of the detour. I just want to tell you about the deer. And why was I on that road? Well, in fact, I was on that road because there was a detour. But the connection is unconscious. So I'm not attempting to fit these together. So that's another way of looking at the kind of independence we want. It's not that speaker B is coming along and hearing speaker A and saying, oh, I can tell you why that happened, or something like that. Even if they're both speaking the truth, then the coincidence between their accounts is not undesigned, because even if they're both speaking the truth, even if they both do know what happened, the second person is, in a sense, consciously trying to confirm what the first person said. He may be completely truthful and he may have his own knowledge of what happened, but he's consciously connecting it. So it's not an undesigned coincidence. It still has evidential merit, though. But a true undesigned coincidence, each part of it should be independently connected back to whatever the facts are about the question at issue. Now, what kind of evidence can there be of this type of independence? This is really important because there are two different kinds of evidence that there can be for the relevant type of independence. There's external evidence and there's internal evidence. And unfortunately, some critics of undesigned coincidences, skeptics and unfortunately some Christians as well, only can think of external evidence of independence. Okay? So what's external evidence of independence? Well, to give a kind of a corny example, suppose you had two people who claimed to be psychics and claimed that they could guess what card you pulled when you're in another room. And you lock them up and you take away their phones and you make sure they don't have any earbuds and, all of that. They're fully searched and all they're given is a piece of paper and a pencil. And you say, okay, I'm going to go to another room and I'm going to pull a card and I'll have witnesses to what card I pulled at random from a deck of cards. And in 15 minutes, you write down what card you think I pulled. Okay? So whatever happens at that point, by locking them up separately until after I pull the card and after they've written something down on the piece of paper, I'm externally separating them, and I have external evidence that what they write down is independent. So if they both write down the same card, it's kind of a striking thing, and the reason that it's a striking thing is because they were externally separated. You'll hear about how police, if they have an accident or a crime, what do they want to do? They want to separate the witnesses. Quite understandable. But does it follow that external evidence is the only kind we can have? No, that doesn't follow. So what would be internal evidence of the relevant type of independence? Variations of wording, telling different parts of the event that we couldn't find contained in some other source, okay? Apparent discrepancies. Apparent discrepancies are internal bits of evidence of independence now. The discrepancies may be a problem in and of themselves, but if nothing else, they show that these people are not trying to base their accounts on one another or trying to make them gel, trying to make them come together. Apparent casualness, and I've talked about this in other videos. Just that you just mentioned something in passing and it fits with what the other person said. But you might not even be aware of what the other person said for all that we can tell. That makes the connection subtle. Now I'm going to illustrate these two different types of evidence from the undesigned coincidence that I gave last time. I'm not going to go over that whole coincidence again. If you want to hear more about it, go watch last week's video or listen to last week's podcast. But it was about a British actor who went and visited the terrible Nazi Holocaust camp Bergen-Belsen in the few days after it was liberated by the British forces. And his own biographer at one point doubted that he'd actually been there. And then it was confirmed by an account from a Austrian who hadn't known him at all, who had been brought to Bergen-Belsen by the British to act as a translator, an interpreter, and who actually saw this person, Dirk Bogaard, there. And didn't know who he was, just noticed how sad he looked. And then 10 years later, because Bogaard was an actor, the translator, the Austrian Coden, saw a movie with Bogaard and recognized the person that he had seen. Okay, so that confirmed. In fact, both of the people involved were doubted. Bogaard's biographer doubted him, and Coden's wife doubted him. When Coden saw Bogaard on the screen and said, "That's him, that's the guy I saw, the British soldier I saw looking so sad," his wife said, "Oh, come on, you're crazy," because he was a famous actor. But when we had both testimonies that Bogaard had been present, there couldn't really be any doubt anymore. And people will ask me sometimes, do secular historians use undesigned coincidences? Well, they nowadays don't use that name. We have instances in the 19th century where they actually did use that name, that phrase. It was originally coined by William Paley in the late 18th century. But nowadays, maybe they don't use that name, but they use the concept. And Coldstream, the biographer of Dirk Bogaard, had to change his mind about whether he was present at Bergen-Belsen because of this confirmation from this other person. So I just did give the whole thing, didn't I? Okay, so in that instance, we had both external and internal evidence of independence. What was the external evidence that these accounts both went back to what happened? Well, they didn't know one another. When Coden first recognized Bogaard and spoke to his wife about it, he didn't even know that Bogaard had ever claimed to have been there. So he had no other information about Bogaard's having supposedly been there other than his own recollection of the man who was there and his recognizing the star on the screen. Okay, the actor on the screen. And the same vice versa. Bogaard probably never heard of Coden in his whole life. I mean, I think Bogaard was already dead by the time we got that oral history from Coden. Okay, so he had no idea that anyone had seen him there or had said that he had seen him there or anything like that. So that's external evidence of independence, because they haven't been able to talk to one another, and there isn't a common account that says that Dirk Bogaard was there that they could both be pulling from. So it looks like they're just saying it because they both have memories of the event. But there was also internal evidence, okay, of independence, of the relevant kind of independence. This is very important. Coden simply told of seeing a jeep arrive with some British military in it, and they got out, they're looking around, they're standing there for a while. One of them is just standing there looking, in horror at the dead bodies and everything. And one of the other people said, "Come on," and a name beginning with a D, have it, Dirk or Derek or something like that. "Haven't you seen enough?" And he turned around and his face looked really sad. Coden saw how sad he looked, and so forth. Well, that particular incident was not included in Bogaard's testimony. He didn't tell about standing there looking at the bodies and someone who was with him saying, "Come on, Dirk, haven't you seen enough?" It's not included. And similarly, Coden didn't include the other stuff that Bogaard told about his visit. Like, he told about going around and looking at other buildings and things, and he told about seeing a woman, meeting a woman, and even she was making signs that she wanted to see a newspaper that they had, and she was starving, horrible, because they had been told, "Be careful, don't give them food right now because that could actually kill them because they're something about a certain stage of starvation." But just other aspects of his visit, none of which were included in Coden's account of seeing him there. So there was variation, there was variety, and you could even regard it as an apparent discrepancy, because given the brevity of what Coden narrated, you might wonder, when did this happen in relation to the other parts of the visit that Bogart told about? Like, did they, was this after they toured it, or did they get into the Jeep and then go further into the camp, or what? It seemed too brief. So you could even regard that as an apparent discrepancy, and yet here it was that it was the same person, Dirk Bogart, who was there, whom Coden recognized later. So that's internal evidence of the relevant kind of independent causal line going back to the facts. Why am I emphasizing this so much? Because the gospel authors often were friends with one another, okay? They often had an opportunity to talk with one another. We don't know who all Mark was acquainted with. We know he was supposedly, acquainted with Peter. We don't know what other apostles he may or may not have been acquainted with, but, traditional authorship, John would have been acquainted with Peter, and John would have been, acquainted with Matthew, if Matthew was one of the 12, and Luke probably talked to some of the apostles, and I think that's actually part of where Luke gets some of his eyewitness testimonies from the apostles. So in that sense, they're not witness separated. They haven't all been locked up in separate rooms. They aren't all complete strangers to one another, as Coden and Bogart were strangers to one another. And critics of undesigned coincidences will be just like, that's checkmate for undesigned coincidences. We're done here. They knew each other. They had plenty of opportunity to influence one another. They're telling each other stories. That's a Bart Ehrman phrase. So how could these possibly be undesigned? And yet that doesn't follow that they couldn't be undesigned, because they can have separate lines back to what really happened, even if they know one another. And more importantly, they can be telling their accounts without a conscious reference to the relevant puzzle piece that fits together from the other account, without trying to confirm, without trying to allude to that part of the other account, without trying to make them fit together. Just as if I tell about, almost hitting a deer, I'm not saying to myself, oh, and this will help that person to believe me that there really was a detour, because I'm mentioning that I was on such and such a road, and that's the road you would take on the detour to get to that store, and he knows that, and, I gave him an account of the detour before, and isn't that cool? See how they fit together? I'm not even thinking about the detour. I'm certainly not trying to confirm the detour. I'm telling you a story about almost hitting a deer. Okay, so, and when you have that kind of internal evidence, the subtlety, the casualness, the fact that one person mentions one thing and another person mentions a different thing, and so forth, that can be enough to confirm the relevant kind of independence, that they're not basing those accounts on one another, without needing external evidence that they couldn't have even known of each other's accounts, or that they had never even met each other. In fact, there's an inverse relationship. The more evidence we have externally of independence, the less evidence we need internally of independence. And the more evidence internally we have of independence, the less evidence we need externally of independence. Okay, you see how that works? And think about my psychic example. Maybe all that we're going to have on these pieces of paper would be the Queen of Hearts, just one brief phrase. So there's no opportunity for variations of detail or something like that. It's not like two different people telling a story of an accident and then they kind of vary in the details they tell. It's just one short phrase. So there's not opportunity for internal evidence of independence. In fact, I think this is very improbable, I don't believe really in psychics, but if they were both psychics, what would you have? You'd have them both just saying the Queen of Hearts. It would be absolutely identical, wouldn't it? So there would be no internal evidence of independence, of independent access to what card you pulled. The only way you could argue that it was independent access would be from the precautions you took to lock them up. Okay? But if you have all kinds of internal evidence of independence between the accounts, then even if you know that these people are friends with each other, you can still have an undesigned coincidence. You can still have good reason to believe that the agreement, the coincidence between their accounts arises from knowledge of the facts, from knowledge of the truth, rather than arising from some kind of common non-factual source or from getting their stories from one another or colluding with one another or anything of that kind. Because you have a lot of this internal evidence of they're telling their stories independently. Okay, that's important. My plan next time is to try to give another non-biblical example, another secular example of an undesigned coincidence and of internal evidence specifically there of independence, even though for all I know, I'm not a researcher into the relevant period, the people might have known one another. So once again, people are so interested sometimes, does anybody else use undesigned coincidences? And the answer is, without labeling them that way, yes. So come back next time for another one of those. I thank you for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew, and we're making common sense rigorous.